The first flakes were not gentle. They were hard and sharp, like chips of ice flung from a grinder, and they did not drift but drove horizontally in a wind that had a voice. It was a low, hungry moan that stripped the last dead leaves from the aspens and sent them skittering across the frozen ground. Elias Thorne felt the pressure change in his sinuses, a deep ache that was more reliable than any barometer. He pulled the collar of his wool coat tighter around his neck and gave the reins a gentle tug. "Easy, Copper," he murmured. The big sorrel horse tossed its head, nostrils flaring as it tasted the metallic tang of the coming storm. The animal's trust was absolute, a simple, profound faith that shamed the complicated doubts of men. They were making their last run, hauling a final wagon load of cured firewood from the stand of deadfall pine on the upper ridge. It was not a task for a sane man, not with a sky the color of a fresh bruise. But Elias operated on a timeline dictated by the land, not the calendar. He looked toward his homestead, a strange silhouette against the darkening horizon. It did not look like the other cabins that dotted the valley. From a distance, it appeared as a great glittering mound, a long arch of glass and timber hunkered down against the earth. His Folly. That's what they called it in town. Thorne's Folly. A house inside a greenhouse. A madman's crystal palace on the unforgiving frontier. He spurred Copper into a steady trot. The wind was getting teeth. They had to get inside. The great door, a heavy thing of oak and iron, was waiting. He did not fear the storm. He had built his answer to it. 6 months earlier, Elias had stood in the dusty office of the territorial land surveyor, Mr. Gable. Spread between them on a scarred oak table was a set of detailed drawings rendered in charcoal and ink on stretched vellum. Sheriff Brody leaned against a filing cabinet, arms crossed, a look of paternal amusement on his face. "Let me be sure I understand this, Elias," Gable had said, tapping a long, thin finger on the topmost drawing. It showed a cross-section, a small, sturdy log cabin nestled entirely inside the sweeping arch of a much larger structure. "You intend to build a standard cabin, and then build a glass house over the entire thing?" "A greenhouse, yes," Elias corrected him gently. "The term is important." "A greenhouse," Gable repeated, the word tasting foreign and absurd. "For what purpose? You planning on growing orchids through the winter?" Sheriff Brody chuckled. "Now, Elias, we all know you've got your own way of doing things. But this," he gestured at the plans, "this seems a bit much, even for you. The weight of the snows we get here. That much glass would be crushed by January." Elias met their skepticism with the quiet patience of a man who had spent years learning to read signs they could not see. He had been a cavalry scout in his youth, tasked with finding safe passage through impossible terrain. He had learned that the conventional path was often the most dangerous. Nature did not follow straight lines. "The arch is the strongest shape in nature, Sheriff," he explained, his voice low and even. "It will shed the snow, not bear it. The pitch is precisely calculated, and the glass will be angled to catch the low winter sun. It will create a pocket of temperate air around the core cabin, a buffer zone." Gable squinted at the plans again. "A buffer zone? What for? A well-built cabin with a good stove is all a man needs." "A good stove needs fuel," Elias countered. "An endless supply of it in a winter like the one that's coming. The winters here follow a pattern. I've watched the migrations of the birds, the thickness of the beaver dams, the depth of the frost for 3 seasons. The signs all point to a long, deep cold. one that will exhaust a man's woodpile by February and leave him freezing in March. "You're a fortune teller now, are you?" Brody asked, his smile tightening. "I'm an observer," Elias said simply. "The structure will serve two purposes. First, the buffer of air, warmed by the sun even on the coldest days, will mean my cabin needs only a fraction of the firewood to stay warm. The heat that bleeds from my chimney and walls won't be lost to the wind. It'll be captured in the outer shell. Second," he paused, letting them lean in, "I will grow food all winter long." That was when the laughter started. It was not unkind, not yet, but it was dismissive. Gable shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Elias, nothing grows here past October. The ground freezes 4 feet deep." "It's impossible." "The ground inside the shell won't freeze," Elias stated. "It will be insulated by the structure and the snow that piles against its base. I will have raised beds. I will have fresh greens, potatoes, carrots. While the rest of the valley is eating salted pork and dried beans, I will have a garden." The meeting ended with pats on the shoulder and quiet suggestions that he reconsider, that he build a normal cabin, like a sensible man. The news of his plans spread through the small settlement of Providence Creek like a grass fire. It became the town's favorite joke. "Thorne's Folly! The glass coffin!" Children would whisper and point when he rode into town for supplies. Men would stop their conversations and watch him, shaking their heads. He was the madman on the hill, building his monument to lunacy. Elias paid them no mind. He had his plans. He had his horse. He had his work. The work began with the site. He did not choose the flat, easy land by the creek. He chose a spot halfway up the southern face of a low ridge, a place that required him to carve out a level terrace from the stony soil. The townsfolk saw this as more proof of his madness. It was a hard, unforgiving place to build. But Elias saw what they did not. The ridge behind him would blunt the force of the northern winds, the primary carriers of the winter storms. The southern exposure would guarantee maximum sunlight from dawn until dusk. He dug the foundations himself, with pick and shovel, a grueling, solitary task. He went down 5 feet, below the deepest frost line he had ever measured. He laid a foundation of massive field stones, hauled one by one on a stone boat dragged by copper. This foundation was not just for the inner cabin. It was a wide, continuous rectangle that would support the entire outer shell. The stone would act as a thermal mass, a heat sink, absorbing the sun's warmth during the day and radiating it back slowly through the night. Every element had a purpose. The inner cabin was a simple affair, but flawlessly executed. He felled the logs himself, lodgepole pines chosen for their uniformity and strength. He peeled the bark and let them cure through the dry summer heat. He notched them with an axe and adze, each joint so tight it needed no chinking, though he sealed them anyway with a mixture of mud, moss, and line. The cabin was small, just a single room with a sleeping loft. The windows were few and small, facing into the space that would become the greenhouse. The only large feature was the hearth and chimney, a massive structure of river stone and clay that stood at the very center of the cabin. It was a Russian stove design, built with a winding series of internal flues that captured the maximum amount of heat from a slow, efficient fire before venting the smoke. It was the heart of his system. Once the cabin's roof was on, the truly strange work began. This was the part that cemented his reputation as an eccentric. For the great arches of the greenhouse, he needed long, strong, flexible timbers. He selected young, healthy ash trees, felling them and milling them into long, thick beams. Then he built a steam box, a long, insulated trough of wood and tin over a perpetual fire. He would place a beam into the box for hours until it was saturated with hot steam, pliable as a green willow branch. Then came the fight. With Copper straining at one end of a block and tackle, and Elias using all his strength and leverage at the other, he would haul the steaming beam onto a huge earthen form, a curved mound he had shaped to the exact arc he needed. He would clamp it down with iron pins and heavy stones, forcing the wood to bend against its will. He would leave it there for days to cool and set. He broke 3 beams before he perfected the technique. Each success was a monument to his persistence, a perfect, sweeping curve of wood. He raised the great arched ribs one by one, setting them onto the stone foundation. They rose over the inner cabin like the skeleton of some great whale. He connected them with purlins, creating a framework of immense strength and surprising grace. The townspeople who rode out the gawk at his progress saw only a bizarre wooden cage. Elias saw the bones of his sanctuary. The glass was his greatest expense. It arrived by freight wagon from the east, packed in immense crates filled with straw. The arrival was a town event. Men who had never spoken to him before offered to help him haul it, their curiosity overcoming their ridicule. He politely refused. He and Copper moved every crate themselves. Each pane was a half-inch thick, heavy and precious. He devised a pulley system to lift them into place, setting each one into the grooved wooden frame. He sealed the edges with a mixture of pine pitch and wool felt, a foul-smelling, sticky job that left him coated in black resin for weeks. But the seal was waterproof and airtight. When the last pane was in place, he stepped inside for the first time. The world outside went quiet. The wind, a constant companion on the ridge, was silenced. The light inside was diffuse and warm. The small log cabin sat in the center of the vast sunlit space, like a hermit crab in a new shell. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood, stone, and damp earth. The final phase was the interior. Between the walls of the cabin and the outer glass shell, he built long, deep raised beds from thick planks. He filled them with a carefully layered mixture of soil, sand, river silt, and compost from his midden heap. This was the lifeblood of his plan. He built a large cistern at the north end of the structure, fed by gutters that collected every drop of rain and snowmelt from the vast glass roof. A simple hand pump would allow him to water his garden. He built vents into the peak of the roof and along the base of the walls, operable by a system of ropes and pulleys. These would be crucial to regulate the temperature, to release excess heat in the late summer, and to seal in the warmth during the winter. By the time the first cold snap of autumn arrived, Thorn's folly was complete. He had stockpiled his supplies, sacks of flour, beans, salted meat, and crates of seeds. His wood pile was stacked high within the greenhouse, where it would stay dry and season perfectly. He lived a quiet, methodical life. He would wake in the inner cabin, start a small, slow fire in the stone hearth, and then step out into the garden, the temperate space between his home and the world. The temperature difference was already noticeable. While a hard frost silvered the ground outside, the air inside the glass was merely cool. The soil in his beds remained dark and pliable. He made his weekly trip to town for things he couldn't produce himself: salt, coffee, lamp oil. The mockery had not subsided. It had solidified into a kind of permanent local folklore.
"How's the palace, Elias?" the blacksmith would call out. "Don't get a sunburn in there."
But there was a new edge to it now, a flicker of unease. The signs Elias had predicted were beginning to appear for everyone to see. The geese had flown south a month early. The squirrels were frantic, their movements jerky and desperate. The first snows came in October, dusting the peaks, and not melting. The trappers coming down from the high country spoke of abnormal cold, of streams freezing solid overnight. The air grew still and heavy, carrying a strange clarity that made distant mountains seem close enough to touch. A pale, sunless halo often ringed the moon. Elias observed it all with a calm sense of validation. He felt no smugness, only a deep affirmation that he had listened correctly. He spent his days preparing his garden beds, turning the soil, and making his final preparations. Copper grew restless. The horse would stand in his paddock, which was also inside the greenhouse, and stare out through the glass, his ears twitching, his breath pluming in the cool air. The animal knew. Then came the day of the storm. It began not as snow, but as a change in the light. The sun, which had been bright and cold, seemed to vanish behind a high, thin veil of grey that swallowed the blue of the sky. The temperature plummeted. Within an hour, it dropped 20 degrees. The wind began its low moan, the sound that had greeted Elias and Copper on the ridge. That was when he knew it was time. He secured the last of his gear, latched the paddock gate, and sealed the great outer door. The heavy oak thumped into its frame, and the iron bar dropped into its brackets with a solid, final clang. Outside, the world could do its worst. Inside, he was ready. The first hours of the storm were a symphony of escalating fury. The wind shrieked, a high, thin sound that scoured the glass. The ice flakes hit not with a patter, but with a sharp, aggressive hiss, like sand being blasted against the panes. Elias lit a single lamp in the cabin. He started a small fire in the stone hearth, using only a few pieces of the cured pine. He watched the thermometer he had hung in the garden space. Outside, the temperature was already well below zero. Inside the greenhouse, it hovered at a brisk 40 degrees. Inside the cabin, with the small fire going, it was a comfortable 65. He moved from the cabin to the garden space, walking the perimeter, checking the seals around the glass. The structure was holding perfectly. The great arched beams groaned softly under the assault of the wind, but it was the sound of a strong ship in a heavy sea, a sound of resilience, not failure. The wind, broken by the ridge behind him, flowed over the curved roof, unable to get a purchase. The snow and ice did not accumulate. It was scoured away by the gale or slid down the steep pitch of the glass to pile in deep drifts against the stone foundation. He fed Copper, who was calm now that he was inside, munching contentedly on his hay. He made himself a simple supper of beans and bacon and ate it at his small table inside the cabin, listening to the storm. It was a terrifying sound, a maelstrom of raw power. But it was a sound from another world. Here, inside his folly, there was peace. There was the smell of warm stone, dry wood, and damp earth. Through the first night, the blizzard raged. He slept soundly in his loft, the storm a distant lullaby. He woke the next morning to a changed world. The light filtering through the glass was pale and blue. The snow had buried the lower panes of glass completely, but the upper portions were clear. Outside, there was nothing to see but a churning, white chaos. The wind had not lessened. He checked his thermometers again. Outside, 20 below zero, and that was before the wind. Inside the garden, 38 degrees. Inside the cabin, 62 degrees, and the fire had burned down to embers. The stone hearth was radiating a gentle, steady warmth. The system was working even better than he had hoped. For 3 days, the storm was relentless. Elias fell into a simple, peaceful routine. He tended his fire, fed his horse, and read his books. He planted his first winter seeds in the raised beds, hardy lettuces, spinach, radishes, and carrots. It felt like an act of profound faith, placing tiny seeds into the soil while the world froze around him. The drifts against the foundation grew deeper, piling up against the glass. This, too, was part of his design. The snow was a magnificent insulator. The deeper the drifts, the more protected the foundation became from the bitter cold, and the more stable the interior temperature remained. On the fourth day, he heard a new sound. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on the heavy outer door. He was so startled, he dropped the book he was reading. No one could be out in this. It was impossible. He grabbed his heavy coat and a lantern, his heart hammering in his chest. He pulled the heavy bar from the door and heaved it open. A figure, crusted in snow and ice, fell into the entryway. It was a man, his face a mask of frozen terror. Behind him, a woman huddled, clutching a small, blanket-wrapped bundle. It was the Miller family, whose small cabin was a mile down the valley, in what was considered a more sheltered spot. "Help us," John Miller gasped, his words ragged. "The roof, the weight of the snow. It came down. The chimney is blocked." We were freezing, suffocating. Elias ushered them in quickly, pushing the heavy door closed against the wind. The Millers stumbled into the vast, calm space of the greenhouse and stopped, their eyes wide with disbelief. They stared at the green plants in their beds, at the dry, stacked firewood, at the calm horse in his paddock. They looked from the swirling blizzard, visible through the upper panes of glass, to the tranquil sanctuary around them. They had stepped from a frozen hell into a strange, temperate paradise. Mary Miller began to sob, silent tears freezing on her cheeks as she looked at the rows of soil. Is it real?" she whispered. "It's real," Elias said, his voice gentle. "You're safe now. Come inside the cabin. There's warmth and soup." He settled them inside the small, warm log house. He gave them hot broth and blankets. The child, a little girl of 4, had a hacking cough. The smoke from their blocked chimney had done its work. As they slowly thawed, John Miller told their story. Their roof, a standard shallow pitch, had collected the heavy, wind-driven snow until the central beam snapped. They had nearly been crushed. They tried to keep a fire going, but the collapsed roof had blocked the chimney flue, filling the one remaining corner of their home with thick, acrid smoke. Their firewood, stored in an open-sided shed, was buried under a 10-foot drift. They were freezing, choking, and hopeless. Their only chance was to try and reach Thorn's Folly, the place they themselves had laughed about just weeks before. Their desperate trek had been a nightmare, a blind struggle through chest-deep snow and a wind that stole the breath from their lungs. They were the first. 2 days later, a half-frozen trapper who had been caught on his line stumbled to the door, led by the faint, diffuse glow of Elias's lantern through the storm. He had lost 2 toes to frostbite, but he was alive. He, too, stared in silent awe at the impossible garden in the heart of the blizzard. For 8 days, the storm, which would later be known as the Great White Hurricane, buried the valley. Inside his sanctuary, Elias cared for his refugees. The small cabin was crowded, but the atmosphere was one of hushed reverence. They ate fresh salad greens with their salted meat, a miracle that brought tears to Mary Miller's eyes. The little girl's cough subsided in the warm, clean air. They watched Elias tend his plants, his movements calm and purposeful. They saw not a madman, but a prophet. When the storm finally broke, the silence was as shocking as the noise had been. The sun came out, dazzlingly bright on a world of white. Elias opened the door to a landscape transformed and brutalized. The valley was a sea of undulating drifts, 20 feet deep in places. Of the other cabins, only the faint outlines of rooftops were visible. Chimneys were gone. Sheds had vanished. The forest looked like a collection of broken sticks. He emerged into the cold, crisp air, the silence broken only by the crunch of his snowshoes. He was followed by John Miller and the trapper. The devastation was absolute. They made their way to the Miller cabin first. It was a ruin, a collapsed heap of logs and snow. They found their neighbors, the Carsons, next. The roof of their well-built home had held, but they had run out of wood. They had frozen to death in their beds. It was a scene repeated across the valley. Of the 12 homesteads in Providence Creek, only Thorn's Folly had survived intact. The others were either crushed, or their inhabitants had succumbed to the cold or to fire, as desperate people tried to keep their stoves going in compromised cabins. Sheriff Brody and a search party from the town, which had fared little better, reached his ridge by the afternoon. They had lost 4 buildings in the town itself and more than a dozen people. The sheriff's face was grey with exhaustion and grief. He stood before the great glass structure, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at the healthy, safe people emerging from it. He looked at Elias. "Thorn," he said, his voice hoarse. He took off his hat, holding it in his raw, chapped hands. I was wrong." It was not an apology so much as a confession. "We called you a fool. We laughed. And we died for it. You saw this coming." Elias simply nodded. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a deep, weary sorrow for what had been lost. "The land spoke," he said. "I just listened." In the weeks that followed, Thorn's Folly became a beacon of hope. It was the only place in the valley with a surplus of food and warmth. Elias shared everything he had. His impossible winter garden fed the survivors. He taught them the principles of his design, sketching the arch and the thermal mass in the snow for men whose homes were gone. He explained the importance of the windbreak, the southern exposure, the insulated foundation. They listened now, not with ridicule, but with the desperate attention of students who had failed a fatal test. That spring, when the great melt came, they did not rebuild their cabins in the same old way. They built on the south-facing slopes. They built with stone foundations and steeper roofs. And 2 families, with Elias's guidance, began the arduous process of building their own thorn shells, as they came to be called. His folly had become the new standard for wisdom. Elias Thorn lived in his glass house for another 30 years. He was never again seen as an outcast. He became a respected elder, a quiet man whose advice on everything from planting to building was sought as if it were scripture. His structure stood as a testament to his foresight, its glass panes weathering to a soft sea-green tint, the wooden beams aging to a silver grey. It saved more lives in the hard winters that followed, always a sanctuary for those caught unprepared. In the end, the legacy he left was not one of wood and glass, but of a simple, powerful idea. It was a lesson etched into the memory of the valley, that the most radical notions are sometimes the most practical, and that true wisdom is often mistaken for madness. It was the quiet triumph of a man who had chosen to listen to the whispers of the wind and the lessons of the sun, rather than the loud, confident voices of men. His greatest companion, Copper, lived out his days in the warmth of the paddock, a loyal friend who had never for a moment doubted the man who built a garden in the heart of winter.